0700 hours. March 3rd, 1943. The Bismarck Sea. Below, a massive Japanese armada cuts through the water. 8 troop transports protected by a screen of 8 combat destroyers. It is a floating fortress. According to the official U.S. Army Air Force flight manual, the only way to attack a force this heavy is from 10,000 feet, using a Norden bombsight to drop ordnance well above the reach of enemy flak. But the B-25 Mitchell bombers approaching from the horizon aren't at 10,000 feet. They are screaming in at 50 feet masthead height. By every conventional rule of aerial warfare, these pilots are committing suicide. They are flying straight into the teeth of 40 Japanese anti-aircraft guns. But as the Japanese gunners traverse their weapons to shred the incoming planes, the physics of the battle suddenly invert. The solid glass nose of the lead American bomber doesn't reflect sunlight. It erupts. 8 50 caliber machine guns, bolted directly to the airframe, open fire simultaneously. The recoil is so violent it slows the aircraft in mid-air. The stream of lead hits the Japanese destroyer Asashio like a chainsaw, turning the ship's steel bridge into a slaughterhouse before the crew can fire a single shot. To understand how a clumsy medium bomber was hacked into a supersonic destroyer killer against the direct orders of military engineers, we have to go back to a dusty hangar in Australia and a madman named Pappy Gunn. To understand why a 40-year-old airline mechanic was hacking apart a $1 million bomber in a Brisbane hangar, you have to understand the lie that the United States Army Air Force had told itself for a decade. That lie was called the Norden bombsight. Before 1941, American military doctrine was built on a single, elegant theory: high-altitude precision bombing. The generals believed that heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress could fly at 20,000 feet, well above the effective range of enemy anti-aircraft fire, and drop bombs with such mathematical accuracy that they could, in the famous phrase of the era, drop a pickle into a barrel. The device that made this promise was the Norden bombsight. It was an analog computer of exquisite complexity, a mechanism of gears and gyroscopes so secret that pilots had to swear an oath to protect it with their lives. In the clear, calm skies over a test range in Arizona, against a stationary wooden target, the Norden worked perfectly. But the Pacific Theater was not a test range in Arizona. When the war against Japan began, the theory collided violently with reality. In New Guinea, the weather was a chaotic mix of tropical storms and low cloud ceilings that rendered high-altitude optics useless. But the bigger problem was simple physics. The targets in the Pacific weren't stationary factories or rail yards, they were ships. Consider the geometry of the problem. A B-17 flying at 20,000 feet releases a bomb. It takes approximately 35 to 40 seconds for that gravity weapon to impact the ocean's surface. In those 40 seconds, a Japanese destroyer traveling at 30 knots moves half a mile. The Japanese captains were skilled. They would watch the bomb bay doors open, wait for the release, and then simply turn the rudder hard to starboard. The bombs would splash harmlessly into the empty wake where the ship had been 30 seconds ago. The statistics were humiliating. In early engagements, B-17 squadrons dropped hundreds of thousands of pounds of high explosives on moving Japanese convoys. The hit rate was effectively zero. It was a waste of fuel, ordnance, and aviation fuel that the Allies couldn't afford to lose. The pilots knew it. The crews knew it. But the doctrine remained. Stay high. Trust the sight. General George Kenney, the aggressive new commander of the 5th Air Force, looked at the numbers in mid-1942 and realized the doctrine was losing the war. If they couldn't hit the ships from the stratosphere, they had to get closer. They had to get down into the mud. This led to the first desperate experiments with the Douglas A-20 Havoc. The A-20 was a light bomber, fast, agile, and rugged. The pilots of the 3rd Attack Group began flying masthead attacks. They dropped down to 50 feet above the water, flying straight at the Japanese transports to release their bombs horizontally, trying to smash them into the hull. But this tactic revealed a new, fatal flaw in the American arsenal. To fly at 50 feet meant flying directly down the barrel of every anti-aircraft gun on the enemy ship. A Japanese transport was bristling with 25mm autocannons and heavy machine guns. As the A-20 seconds approached, they became huge, stable targets for the Japanese gunners. The A-20 seconds tried to fight back, but they were toothless. The standard A-20 carried only 4 30 caliber machine guns in the nose. The .30 caliber round is a rifle bullet. Against enemy infantry, it is lethal. Against the quarter-inch steel armor of a ship's hull or a gun shield, it is rain. The pilots of the 3rd Attack Group reported watching their tracers bounce off the Japanese decks like hail. They couldn't penetrate the gun shields. They couldn't kill the gun crews. They would start their run, open fire, and see the Japanese gunners simply stand their ground and return fire with heavy cannons. The results were catastrophic. In July 1942, crews were burning in the Coral Sea. Aircraft were returning to Port Moresby, looking like colanders. Fuselage skins shredded by shrapnel. Pilots bleeding from wounds caused by glass shards from their own shattered windscreens. The logic of the stalemate was brutal. You couldn't bomb from high altitude because you couldn't hit the target. You couldn't bomb from low altitude because the target would kill you on the approach. The pilots needed a way to survive the approach phase, that terrifying 20-second run where the plane is flying straight and level, exposed to everything. They needed to suppress the deck guns. They didn't need .30 caliber rifle bullets. They needed cannon fire. They needed a weapon that could punch through steel plating and turn a gun crew into mist before the bomber even released its payload. They needed the Browning M2 .50 caliber heavy machine gun, but the A-20 was too small to carry the heavy battery required to suppress a destroyer. It lacked the physical space in the nose and the lift capacity to carry the weight of the guns and the ammunition. The Air Force needed a bigger platform. They needed a plane with the range of a bomber but the agility of a fighter. They needed the B-25 Mitchell. But the B-25 was designed as a medium bomber, with a glass nose for a bombardier to sit in and look through a Norden bombsight. It had exactly one flexible machine gun in the nose, operated by a man crawling on his knees. It was a defensive weapon, useless for an attack. The engineers at North American Aviation said the B-25 was finished. The design was locked. It was a bomber, not a fighter. You couldn't just stuff heavy artillery into the nose of a balanced aircraft. The center of gravity would shift, the landing gear would collapse, and the frame would warp. To the engineers, the conversation was over. To Pappy Gunn, standing in that humid hangar in Brisbane, watching the casualty reports stack up on his desk, the conversation was just beginning. He didn't care about aerodynamics. He cared about the fact that the Japanese were reinforcing New Guinea at will, and his friends were dying because they didn't have enough gun. He looked at the B-25's glass nose, the office of the bombardier, and his useless bomb sight, and he didn't see a delicate optical station. He saw empty real estate. That empty real estate in the nose of the B-25 was about to be occupied by the obsession of a man who, by all rights, shouldn't have even been wearing an American uniform. Captain Paul Irvin Gunn, known universally as Pappy, was 43 years old. In a military built on youth and physical perfection, Gunn was a relic. He walked with a slight limp, the result of a pre-war crash, and possessed a demeanor that terrified junior officers and amused generals. Before the war, he hadn't been a soldier. He had been the founder and operations manager of Philippine Airlines. He was a pioneer of jungle aviation, a man who moved cargo through typhoons using a fleet of Beechcraft planes and baling wire. But Pappy Gunn was fighting a different war than the rest of the 5th Air Force. When the Japanese seized Manila in 1942, they captured his wife, Polly, and his 4 children. They were now interned in the Santo Tomas prison camp, starving behind barbed wire. Every modification Gunn made, every bolt he tightened, was calculated with a singular, savage arithmetic. How many Japanese soldiers could this machine kill to clear the road back to his family? Gunn looked at the B-25 Mitchell sitting on the tarmac at Eagle Farm Airfield in Brisbane and decided to commit aeronautical heresy. The B-25 was a balanced machine. Its center of gravity, lift coefficients, and drag profiles had been calculated by hundreds of engineers at North American Aviation. Gunn didn't care. He walked into the boneyard, the scrap heap of the airfield, and started cannibalizing. He found the wreckage of P-40 Warhawks and P-39 Airacobras, fighters that had been destroyed on the ground or scrapped after crash landings. The planes were dead, but their hearts were still beating. He stripped the Browning AN M2 .50 caliber machine guns out of the wings of the wrecked fighters. The M2 is a heavy, brutal piece of industrial machinery. Each gun weighs 84 pounds. It fires a projectile the size of a man's finger at 2,900 feet per second. Gunn didn't want one. He wanted a battery. He dragged a B-25C, serial number 41 to 12443, into a hangar at the far end of the field. He removed the bombardier's seat. He removed the Norden bombsight, the crown jewel of the Air Force, and tossed it aside. In its place, he designed a crude steel cradle. He wasn't working from blueprints. He was sketching on the concrete floor with a piece of chalk. He mounted 4 50 caliber machine guns in the nose, blasting holes through the plexiglass for the barrels to protrude. Then he looked at the fuselage. It still wasn't enough. He cut holes into the sides of the aircraft, just below the cockpit window, and fabricated external blisters to hold 2 more guns on each side. 8 forward-firing heavy machine guns. Coupled with the top turret locked forward, that made 10. The ground crews watched in horror. Gunn was adding nearly 1,000 pounds of dead weight to the nose of the aircraft. This introduced the teeter-totter nightmare. Every aircraft balances on a specific point called the center of gravity, or CG. It acts like the fulcrum of a seesaw. The wings provide lift, and the tail provides control. If you pile too much weight on the nose, the seesaw tips forward. In flight, a nose-heavy aircraft becomes a lawn dart. When the pilot pulls back on the stick to climb, the elevator in the tail simply doesn't have the leverage to lift the heavy nose. The plane won't climb. On landing, it will drive its front wheel into the concrete and flip over, killing the crew. Gunn's modified B-25 was a geometric disaster. When they first fueled it, the nose strut compressed until it bottomed out. The plane looked like a bull ready to charge, head down, dangerous to its own pilots. A standard engineer would have scrapped the project. The math said the plane was unflyable. Pappy Gunn didn't use math, he used leverage. If the nose was too heavy, he had to make the tail heavier. He went into the fuselage and started ripping out equipment. He moved the heavy radio racks from the cockpit area all the way to the back of the plane, near the tail gunner station. He added lead ballast bars into the tail cone. He shifted the ammunition boxes. He forced the center of gravity back, inch by inch, until the seesaw leveled out. General Kenny stopped by the hangar to inspect the work. He saw a Frankenstein monster, a bomber with a nose bristling with gun barrels, patched with scrap metal, welding scars still fresh on the aluminum skin. It looked angry. It looked like a brawler. "Pappy," Kenny asked, "will it fly?" Gunn wiped grease from his hands. "General, she's nose-heavy, she's ugly, and she's gonna shake the fillings out of the pilot's teeth. But she'll fly." But making it fly was only the first hurdle. The real problem wasn't gravity, it was structural integrity. Gunn had bolted 10 machine guns to an airframe designed to carry none. He had turned a transport vehicle into a recoil absorption platform. When he fired those guns on the test stand, the vibration was so intense it blurred vision. The question wasn't whether the engines would start. The question was whether the first pull of the trigger would rip the nose off the airplane. And back in the United States, the men with the slide rules, the engineers who had actually designed the plane, were about to catch wind of what the madman in Brisbane was doing to their aerodynamic masterpiece. They were preparing a distinct technical rejection. You cannot fire 10 machine guns from a glass house. To the engineers at North American Aviation Headquarters in Inglewood, California, firing 10 machine guns from the nose of a B-25 wasn't just dangerous, it was structural suicide. As news of Pappy Gunn's unauthorized surgery on their aircraft reached the factory, the reaction was immediate and hostile. The design team sent urgent cables to Australia warning that the B-25 was a semi-monocoque airframe. To understand why this mattered, imagine an egg. An egg is incredibly strong if you squeeze it from the top and bottom, but if you pierce the shell, the structural integrity vanishes. The B-25 didn't have a heavy internal steel skeleton. Its strength came from its stressed skin. The aluminum sheets riveted to the ribs were the structure. Gunn wasn't just bolting guns to a floor. He was cutting holes in the load-bearing shell of a high-performance aircraft. The engineers predicted 2 specific, catastrophic failures. First, oil canning. Gunn had mounted 2 machine guns on each side of the fuselage in external cheek packs. The muzzles of these guns were positioned just inches from the thin aluminum skin of the cockpit. The factory warned that the muzzle blast from a 50 caliber round, an explosion of expanding gas, exiting the barrel at supersonic speed, would act like a hammer, striking the side of the plane. Multiply that by 750 rounds per minute, per gun. The engineers calculated that the sonic pressure would cause the fuselage skin to ripple in and out violently, oil canning, until the metal fatigued, cracked, and eventually peeled off the airframe in mid-flight. They envisioned pilots flying convertibles at 200 miles per hour. Second, the phantom engine. This was a problem of pure Newtonian physics. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. A single M2 Browning generates hundreds of pounds of recoil force. When you fire 8 to 10 of them simultaneously, you are generating nearly 4,000 pounds of rearward force. The B-25's engines produced thrust to push the plane forward. Gunn's battery of guns produced a massive, violent thrust pushing the plane backward. The factory warned that this recoil force would be transmitted directly into the nose frame, the glass house, designed to hold a 150-pound bombardier, not a 2-ton artillery battery. They predicted the vibration would shatter the instrument panel glass, shake the compass magnets out of alignment, and potentially shear the rivets holding the nose section to the fuselage. They recommended grounding the modified aircraft immediately. Pappy Gunn read the objections. He understood the physics. He just didn't accept the conclusion. He tackled the oil canning problem with the subtlety of a blacksmith. If the skin was too thin to take the blast, he wouldn't redesign the gun. He would reinforce the skin. He scavenged heavy-gauge steel plating and welded blast patches onto the fuselage sides where the muzzle pressure was highest. Then, he improvised a solution that would become standard on fighter jets decades later. He realized the gas was expanding too soon. He welded steel tubes onto the gun barrels, extending the muzzle so the blast occurred 2 feet further away from the aircraft skin. He created blast tubes. It wasn't aerodynamic, it looked like the plane had whiskers, but it moved the shockwave away from the fragile aluminum. Then came the test of the phantom engine. Gunn took the prototype, now christened Margaret, after a distant relative, though the crew called it something far less polite, up for a live fire test over the Coral Sea. He leveled off at 1,000 feet. He charged the weapons. When he squeezed the trigger, the effect was terrifying. The entire airframe shuddered as if it had hit a brick wall. The cockpit filled with the acrid, biting smell of cordite. The noise was a physical blow, a deafening roar that drowned out the twin Wright Cyclone engines. But the most shocking thing was the airspeed indicator. As the 10 guns roared, the B-25 literally slowed down. The recoil force was so massive it acted as an air brake, stripping knots off the plane's velocity in seconds. The vibration rattled Gunn's teeth and blurred his vision, shaking the control yoke in his hands. But when he let go of the trigger, the vibration stopped. He checked the wings. They were still attached. He checked the nose. It hadn't sheared off. He checked the fuselage skin. The blast patches were scorched black, but the metal hadn't buckled. The plane flew like a dump truck. It was nose-heavy, loud, and vibrated like a jackhammer. But it was a flying gun platform that could unleash 120 heavy-caliber rounds in a 1-second burst. Gunn landed Margaret at Port Moresby and taxied to the revetment. He didn't send a technical report back to the engineers in California. He simply told General Kenny the planes were ready. The timing was perfect, because 400 miles to the north, the Japanese Navy had just launched the convoy that the B-25 was built to destroy. The paper pushers had said the plane was impossible. Now, the combat test was about to prove whether the impossible could kill. The combat test arrived on the morning of March 3rd, 1943, in the damp, gray air over the Bismarck Sea. Major Ed Larner, commanding the 90th Bomb Squadron, led the formation. Larner wasn't flying a standard approach. He was threading a needle through a mathematical tunnel known as the death envelope. To make Pappy Gunn's concept work, the pilots had to ignore every instinct trained into them at flight school. They couldn't dive, they couldn't bank, they couldn't jink to avoid fire. They had to fly straight and level, directly into the kill zone of the Japanese destroyers. This was the strict, unforgiving physics of skip bombing. Think of a flat stone skipped across a pond. If you throw the stone too steep, it plunges underwater. If you throw it too high, it loses momentum and sinks. To make a 500-pound bomb behave like that stone, the B-25 had to be flying between 200 and 250 miles per hour at an altitude of exactly 50 feet. Any lower, and the blast splash from the bomb would catch the tail of the aircraft and tear it off. Any higher, and the bomb would strike the water at a steep angle and dive deep, exploding harmlessly under the keel. The margin of error was zero, and they had to maintain this precise geometry while flying directly at a 2,000-ton destroyer commanded by a captain who knew exactly how to kill them. But the Japanese commanders made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed they were fighting the B-25 of 1942, a bomber that had to fly over them to attack. They prepared their anti-aircraft crews to track high-altitude targets. They were not prepared for the symphony of violence that Pappy, Gunn, and General Kenny had orchestrated. The first movement of this symphony wasn't American. It was Australian. Minutes before the B-25 arrived, a squadron of RAAF Beaufighters swept in at deck level. The Beaufighter had a unique, terrifying quality: silence. Its Bristol Hercules engines used sleeve valves that muffled the exhaust noise. The Japanese gunners on the destroyer Shikinami didn't hear them coming until the cannons were already tearing up the water around them. The Australians raked the decks, suppressing the flak crews, forcing the Japanese heads down. Then, just as the Japanese sailors stood up to man their guns again, the hammers arrived. Larner's B-25 emerged from the mist in a line abreast, a solid wall of aluminum wingspans. This was the moment the impossible gunship proved its thesis. As the Japanese destroyer Asashio turned to engage, Larner's flight opened fire at 1,000 yards. This was not the pecking harassment of .30 caliber fire. This was an industrial erasure. Each B-25 was firing 8 to 10 .50 caliber machine guns. The rounds were a mix of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer. The effect on the Japanese ships was grotesque. The heavy rounds didn't just kill men, they dismantled machinery. They punched through the thin steel of the bridge, shattered the glass, and disintegrated the helm. The anti-aircraft crews on the bow were exposed. Against 100 rounds per second of heavy caliber fire, they simply ceased to exist. The Japanese return fire, which should have been a wall of flak, was sporadic and wild. The gunners were dead before they could pull their triggers. The B-25 held the trigger down until they were point-blank 300 yards away. The ships were now blinded, their bridges burning, their decks awash with blood and oil. Then, and only then, did the pilots press the bomb release. The 500-pound bombs fell from the bays. They didn't drop, they glided. They hit the water with a white spray, skipped once, twice, 3 times, skimming over the waves like high-speed sharks. This was the genius of the low-level attack. A bomb dropped from altitude hits the deck of a ship, which is heavily armored. A skip bomb slams into the side of the ship, the hull above the waterline but below the armor belt. Larner's bomb slammed into the transport Arizun Maru. The fuses were set for a 5-second delay to allow the bomber to escape the blast radius. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The ocean erupted. The bombs detonated inside the hulls, blowing the sides of the ships out. The transport Kenyo Maru literally broke in half. The destroyer Tokitsukaze took hits that lifted it out of the water. Within 20 minutes, the invincible convoy was a burning scrapyard. 12 ships were sinking or burning. The water was thick with oil and wreckage. The B-25, the planes the engineers said would shake themselves apart, turned for home. They had expended thousands of rounds of ammunition. They had stressed their airframes beyond the manufacturer's limits. But they hadn't lost a single strafer to enemy fire during the initial run. The logic of the paper pushers had been sound. You cannot fly a medium bomber like a fighter. Pappy Gunn's logic was simpler. You can, if you have enough guns to ensure there's no one left alive to shoot back. Back in Washington, the memo recommending the immediate cancellation of the dangerous Strafer project was finally being typed up. It would arrive on General Kenny's desk just as the reconnaissance photos of the burning Japanese fleet were being developed. As the oil slicks spread across the Huon Gulf, turning the azure waters of the Bismarck Sea into a black, burning graveyard, the telegraph lines between Brisbane and Washington began to hum with a different kind of heat. In New Guinea, the smoke was clearing on what General Douglas MacArthur would call one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't just a victory, it was a deletion. Of the 16 Japanese ships that had left Rabaul, 8 transports and 8 destroyers, 12 were at the bottom of the ocean. 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dead. The reinforcements that were supposed to hold the line in New Guinea had simply ceased to exist. But 10,000 miles away, in the fluorescent-lit offices of the Materiel Command at Wright Field, Ohio, the war was still theoretical. The Army Air Force engineers had finally completed their comprehensive review of Captain Gunn's B-25 modifications. They had run the stress analysis. They had calculated the drag coefficients. They had reviewed the center of gravity shifts. Their conclusion was unanimous, mathematical, and absolute. The Strafer concept was a failure. The report was scathing. It detailed how the recoil of the nose guns would shear the rivets of the bombardier's compartment. It explained that the cheek packs, the external guns, blistered onto the fuselage, created so much parasitic drag that the aircraft would lose 20 miles per hour of airspeed and become unstable in a turn. They argued that the added weight in the nose made the aircraft dangerous to take off and nearly impossible to land. They drafted a formal recommendation to General Hap Arnold, the commander of the U.S. Army Air Force. Ground the modified B-25 seconds immediately. Strip the guns. Return the aircraft to their factory configuration before a pilot is killed by structural failure. General Kenny was in Washington, D.C. when the report landed. He walked into General Arnold's office, where the engineers were waiting with their charts and their slide rules, ready to explain why the Commerce destroyer was an engineering impossibility. The timing could not have been scripted better by Hollywood. As the engineers laid out the aerodynamic reasons why Pappy Gunn's plane wouldn't work, Kenny placed a sheet of paper on General Arnold's desk. It was the preliminary after-action report from the Bismarck Sea. It didn't contain drag coefficients. It contained a body count. Kenny reportedly looked at the engineers and delivered the most devastating rebuttal in the history of military procurement. He told them that the imbalanced, unstable, and structurally unsound aircraft they were trying to ban had just sunk an entire Japanese convoy in 20 minutes. He pointed out that while the engineers were worried about parasitic drag, Major Larner and Pappy Gunn were worried about running out of targets. The silence in the room was absolute. The theoretical perfection of the blueprint had just collided with the violent reality of the scoreboard. General Arnold, a man who preferred results to excuses, didn't argue. He didn't ask for a counter-study. He looked at the report, then he looked at the engineers, and he effectively threw them out of his office. He turned to Kenny and asked a simple question: how many more of these can we build? The telegram that went back to Australia that night didn't order the removal of the guns. It read, "Commerce destroyer modifications approved for production." But the vindication of Pappy Gunn wasn't over. Arnold realized that his factory engineers at North American Aviation, the men who built the plane, didn't understand their own machine as well as the mechanic who had hacked it apart in the jungle. He ordered North American Aviation to stop building standard B-25 seconds and start building Strafers. But the factory engineers were lost. They didn't have blueprints for Gunn's modifications. They only had the complaints they had written about them. They needed the source code. So General Arnold sent another order: bring Pappy Gunn to California. Gunn didn't want to go. His war was in the Pacific. His family was still starving in Santo Tomas. Every day he spent in a factory in Inglewood was a day he wasn't fighting to get them back. But an order is an order. When Gunn arrived at the North American Aviation plant in Inglewood, it was a clash of civilizations. On one side, you had the slide rule commandos, engineers with degrees from MIT and Caltech, men who wore ties and worked in clean, climate-controlled drafting rooms. On the other side was Pappy Gunn, a man with grease under his fingernails, a limp from a plane crash, and a burning hatred for anything that didn't kill Japanese shipping. The meeting about the cheek packs became legendary. The chief aerodynamicist challenged Gunn, insisting that the external gun blisters on the side of the fuselage ruined the airflow. He pulled out wind tunnel data showing the turbulence they created. He asked Gunn, "Captain, do you have any idea how much drag these monstrosities create?" Gunn looked at the chart, then looked at the engineer. "I don't know about the drag," he said. "I never noticed it holding me back while I was skipping bombs into their engine rooms." He then explained the Gunn doctrine of aerodynamics. You don't need a perfectly streamlined aircraft if you have enough horsepower to pull it and enough firepower to make the enemy stop shooting back. The B-25 wasn't a racing plane. It was a dump truck with a shotgun. For 2 weeks, Pappy Gunn walked the assembly line. He showed the factory welders how to reinforce the nose struts to handle the weight. He showed them where to add the blast plates to stop the skin from buckling. He showed them how to balance the aircraft by stripping the tail internals. The result was the B-25G and the B-25H, the first factory-built gunships. The engineers in Washington had been embarrassed, but the Air Force had been transformed. The telegram that tried to kill the project had instead become its birth certificate. The era of the high-altitude guess was over. The era of the Strafer had begun. But as the factory began to churn out these new weapons, they made a critical mistake. They assumed that if Pappy Gunn's 50 caliber machine guns were good, a bigger gun would be better. They fell in love with the idea of a flying tank. They decided to replace Gunn's wall of lead with a single massive cannon, and in doing so, they were about to learn the second lesson of Pappy Gunn. In war, perfect on paper is often fatal in practice. That perfect theoretical weapon was the B-25G, and it represented the single greatest misunderstanding of Pappy Gunn's genius. The engineers at North American Aviation, now fully converted to the cult of the gunship, reasoned that if 8 machine guns were effective, a 75mm field cannon, the same weapon mounted on a Sherman tank, would be unstoppable. They ripped the .50 calibers out of the nose and installed the M4 cannon, a massive artillery piece that took up the entire center aisle of the cockpit. On paper, it was terrifying. A single 75mm shell could hold a destroyer or disintegrate a tank. But when the B-25G arrived in the Pacific, the combat pilots hated it. The problem was the rate of delivery. Pappy Gunn's original commerce destroyer relied on saturation. It threw a wall of lead over 100 rounds per second that suppressed enemy gunners through sheer volume. If you missed with 10 bullets, you had 10 more right behind them. The 75mm cannon, however, relied on precision. It was a single-shot weapon. After firing, the navigator had to unbuckle his harness, crawl into the nose, manually extract the smoking shell casing, wrestle a new 20-pound shell from the rack, and shove it into the breech. In a dive at 300 miles per hour, with the aircraft bucking from turbulence and flak, the rate of fire dropped to 1 round every 20 seconds. If the pilot missed his first shot, the target was gone before the navigator could reload. The Japanese gunners, no longer suppressed by a hail of machine gun fire, had 20 seconds of silence to aim their cannons and blow the B-25 out of the sky. The pilots begged for their machine guns back. They wanted the field hack, not the factory special. North American Aviation listened. They realized that Gunn wasn't just building a gunship, he was pioneering a new doctrine of aerial warfare. They scrapped the cannon and introduced the B-25J. The B-25J was the ultimate vindication of the mechanic from Manila. It abandoned the artillery piece and returned to the chainsaw. It carried 8 .50 caliber guns in a solid nose, 4 in the cheek blisters, 2 in the top turret, and 2 in waist positions. When the pilot pressed the button, 18 heavy machine guns fired forward. This aircraft could deliver 215 pounds of lead and steel per second. It was the most heavily armed aircraft of World War II. It didn't need to aim for a specific porthole. It simply erased the grid square the target occupied. But Gunn's legacy wasn't just about adding more guns. It was about the angle of the guns. During his late war experiments, Gunn began mounting .50 calibers pointing out the side of the aircraft, allowing the pilot to bank around a target and fire continuously while circling a pylon turn. He was experimenting with the geometry of sustained fire. This concept lay dormant for 20 years until the Vietnam War, when another group of engineers remembered Gunn's cheek packs. They took a C-47 transport and later a C-130 Hercules and mounted miniguns and cannons on the left side of the fuselage. They created the AC-130 Spectre gunship. Every time you see modern footage of an AC-130 circling a target, raining down a continuous stream of fire from the night sky, you are watching the direct evolutionary descendant of Pappy Gunn's welding torch. The spooky gunships of Vietnam, the A-10 Warthog of the Cold War, they all share the same DNA. They are all built on the principle that an aircraft isn't just a delivery system for bombs. It is a flying artillery battery. Pappy Gunn survived the war he helped win. He survived the malaria of the jungle, the shrapnel of the Japanese bombs, and the recoil of his own inventions. He retired as a colonel, a legend who had rewritten the textbook on tactical aviation. But there is a cruel irony to the life of men like Paul Gunn. They can survive the calculated violence of war, but they often cannot survive the randomness of peace. In 1957, 12 years after the surrender of Japan, Gunn was flying a civilian Beechcraft Model 18 through a storm over the Philippines. He was 57 years old, still flying the dangerous routes, still pushing the weather, still operating on the edge of the envelope. He had flown through flak curtains that shredded B-25 seconds. He had flown head-on into destroyer fire. But on that rainy afternoon, nature finally caught what the Japanese Navy couldn't. A downdraft slammed his small plane into the side of a mountain near Baguio. The architect of annihilation died instantly. He left behind a transformed air force, a liberated nation, and a technical legacy that is still flying combat missions today. But the real story of Pappy Gunn isn't about the machines. It isn't about the 75mm cannon or the center of gravity shifts. It's about why he did it. Because while the generals were looking at maps and the engineers were looking at blueprints, Pappy Gunn was looking at a photograph of a woman and 4 children, wasting away in a prison camp in Manila. And he knew that every ship he sank, every rule he broke, and every gun he bolted to that airframe brought him 1 mile closer to the only thing that mattered. That distance, the miles between a father and his family, finally closed on February 3rd, 1945. While the B-25 Strafers he designed were hunting the remnants of the Japanese Navy in the South China Sea, the Battle of Manila was raging on the ground. The 1st Cavalry Division had smashed through the gates of the Santo Tomas University, which the Japanese had converted into a squalid internment camp. Pappy Gunn arrived shortly after the tanks. He was physically wrecked. A Japanese bombing raid at Tacloban weeks earlier had filled his body with shrapnel and nearly severed his arm. He was walking with a cane, ignoring the medical officers who had ordered him to stay in bed, and carrying a submachine gun. He moved through the chaos of the liberated camp, past the emaciated faces of 3,700 starving prisoners, looking for the faces that had kept him alive for 3 years. When he found them, in a makeshift clinic, the reunion was a collision of 2 different wars. Pappy Gunn was the architect of a terrifying new form of aerial violence, a man who had remade the Air Force in his own aggressive image. But the woman looking back at him, his wife Polly, weighed less than 90 pounds. His children were skeletal ghosts, survivors of a slow, quiet war of hunger. He had built the ultimate weapon to pave the road to this specific room. The impossible gunship, the defied orders, the shattered laws of aerodynamics. It was all for this. The commerce destroyer had done its job. Paul Gunn's story is the ultimate rebuke to the idea that wars are won by pristine plans drafted in safe offices. The victory in the Pacific was not achieved by following the manual. It was achieved by men like Gunn, who realized the manual was a suicide pact. When the high-altitude doctrine failed, the establishment tried to double down. When the engineers said the nose was too heavy, they tried to cancel the project. At every turn, the system chose the safety of theory over the messiness of reality. And at every turn, Pappy Gunn chose the mess. He reminds us that true innovation is rarely polite. It is often insubordinate. It is greasy, dangerous, and ugly. It happens in humid hangars at 2 a.m., wielded by exhausted men who are welding scrap metal to million-dollar aircraft because they know that good enough is a lie that gets people killed. The B-25 Strafer wasn't just a modification. It was a declaration that the tools of war belong to the warriors, not the designers. If this story of rebellious ingenuity resonated with you, you have a mission. The algorithm favors the loud and the shallow, but we are building an archive of the deep and the true. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. By doing so, you aren't just watching a video. You are helping us preserve the legacy of men like Pappy Gunn, ensuring that their heretical genius is never buried in a dusty file again. Like this video, to help us break the lines and reach more historians. And Pappy Gunn wasn't the only one trying to turn a flying machine into something it wasn't supposed to be. While Gunn was in the Pacific proving that a lumbering bomber could fly like a fighter, a frantic design team in New York was trying to prove that a fighter could be built like a tank. Next time, we are climbing into the cockpit of the P-47 Thunderbolt, the Jug. We will uncover how a plane the size of a barn, which pilots initially mocked as a flying milk bottle, defied the laws of physics to become the most indestructible force in the European theater. The engine was bigger than a man, the dive speed broke the sound barrier, and the story is even stranger than the Strafer. I'll see